The computer's in the shop, so I can't really work on the MKX critique at the minute, but I did want to get something out before the end of January. So I figured the obvious thing to do would be a quick and easy best games of 2017, but I'm not doing it as a simple top 10, that's boring and overdone. Instead, I'll be picking out the best game of each month of 2017, and then probably picking out the best one of those altogether at the end of the video. So let's get started with January. There were two games in January that I really struggled to choose between: Resident Evil 7 Biohazard and Yakuza 0. Both of these games are fantastic and among the best in their series, in Yakuza's case the absolute best of the Yakuza series. Yakuza 0 just has the best gameplay and one of the better stories because it doesn't get bogged down in pointless betrayals and such. It's just a fairly straightforward story with really good characters and bringing back a lot of the ones from the first game who aren't around anymore because, you know, they're Yakuza, so of course there's a lot of deaths in it. There's really good drama, really weird wacky side quests, and of course, fantastic action gameplay. Resident Evil 7, meanwhile, is a bit of a weird one. 7 is the only mainline entry I would say feels like it's not a continuation of the previous game. I feel like there is something of a progression throughout the whole series. Sometimes they'll take a step or two back and go in a different direction like with Revelations 2, but RE7 is something completely different, going from third person horror to first person, and that does change a lot. The setting is also very different. The style is very American horror rather than Japanese trying to imitate American horror. Like, it feels more authentic in that way. There are problems with the game, of course, like the fact that a lot of the content was put in as DLC, but with the complete edition being out now, it's definitely a really good package. And since I have to weigh both games against each other, I'm giving it to RE7. RE7 is probably the game I thought about the most, as this is likely to be my game of the year, with really only one other game coming close to that this year, which I'll be talking about in a bit. Not to disparage Yakuza, of course, because again, it is still a very, very good game. Both of these games are phenomenal games, and I can recommend them to just about anyone because Yakuza 0 is a prequel, so you don't need to know all the backstory to get into it, and Resident Evil 7 is mostly removed from the core series. There are some references here and there, but you're not really going to miss much if you're not familiar with what these things are referencing. Both of these are definitely games to check out, but to me, Resident Evil 7 is just that little bit better. February, though, it's a little more clean cut and not strictly in a good way. I mean, I could put Neo on here because I did play one of the betas and I really like the setting and William is a badass, but I just can't do that. The only full game from February this year that I did play is Berserk and the Band of the Hawk. Unfortunately, this game is on the lower end of Warriors games. It's not bad by any means, it's just there are certain problems with the way the game is structured, like how in over 30 stages of the story mode, there are only 6 where you get to play as anyone other than Guts, even in stages where Guts is still with those characters. Again, it's not bad, it's just that because of the way the game is structured, there's kind of this reliance on the side modes to let you play as the other characters. And there's only 8 to play as, which is pretty low for a Warriors game. I mean, Warriors games are like fighting games, they usually have these huge rosters of playable characters. I'll give the game one thing though, it's hilarious that for the Golden Age arc, the cutscenes are mostly just clips taken directly from the Golden Age arc movies that came out a few years ago. And then when you get past the Golden Age arc and move on to the part of the story that the new CGI anime is adapting, they don't use a single still from that show and instead just recreate the scenes with the game engine itself. Kind of the ultimate fuck you to that travesty, isn't it? There are 2 games from March I played this year, but I can only really put one of them on the list. I played a little bit of Breath of the Wild, just fucking about in the open world to get some footage for the Zelda timeline video, but I really didn't play enough of the game for it to be okay to put it on the list. I'm just not that into the Zelda gameplay, and going open world doesn't really help in this oversaturated market. So the only game I can put on the list for March is Nier Automata. I didn't like Nier Automata, I don't see what everyone else saw in it. I mean, on paper, this seemed like a sure thing. You got this weird auto game director making a game that is an action RPG with Platinum Games combat. That sounds like a surefire hit, right? And for a lot of people it was, but I just didn't like it. I thought the story was pretentious in points, and a lot of the experience was just very unmemorable. And the combat, while not bad, is just some of the least cathartic combat Platinum's ever put out. I've got a couple of videos coming up that relate to Automata. One is of course the Drakengard Nier timeline video, and the other will be a video more specifically about Automata itself that will be a part of a new video series I'm going to be starting that I'll discuss more in the future. For April, there's really only one game you could put on here, let's be honest, Persona 5. This was the first mainline Persona game I've ever played. I've experienced the stories of 4 and 3 through other people playing the games or through adaptations, and the main reason for that is that I'm just not fond of turn-based RPGs. However, don't let that discourage you, because Persona 5 does have an easy difficulty that basically makes all the battles a complete joke, which then allows you to focus more on the story and the characters, which are really good. The strength of the Persona games has never really been the actual turn-based combat itself, but rather the characters and their personal stories and the way you help them through it. It's nothing groundbreaking, it's not really very in-depth, you kind of just sit there and the characters passively have character arcs while you can say a few things to help it move along a little quicker. But it has a really good cast of characters, and I'm really looking forward to seeing these characters appear again in the future. I mean, let's face it, with how much they milked Persona 4, there's no way they're not going to do the same for 5, right? But it's not just the characters in the story, it's also the style. The game oozes style. The way the menus are done, the music, the themes, it's just such a good game. You've probably guessed by now that this was the other game, like Resident Evil 7, that I was constantly thinking about as this is probably going to be Game of the Year. This is another game I highly recommend, even if you're not into turn-based RPGs. Trust me, it's a good one, even if it is a little bit too long. I mean, 90 hours is a bit much. But it's 90 hours of good content, not 90 hours of bad content, unlike Automata. Aside from remasters and re-releases, the only May game I've played was Samurai Warriors Spirit of Sanada. It's an odd game, really. I mean, Samurai Warriors 4 already was focused on the life of Sanada Yukimura, so making a Samurai Warriors 4 spin-off focused on Sanada Yukimura seems a bit pointless. I would have preferred they focused on different characters, maybe those who didn't get much to do in 4, but this is what we were given. The game does suffer if you've played the other 4 games in the Samurai Warriors 4 series, because it's basically just more of the same. There's not much of an evolution to the gameplay. The story structure is very different, having various towns you can visit and having these side missions you go on, and just the fact that the characters age and their movesets evolve through aging, that's pretty cool. They at least swapped around the map so that even if you played the same battle you've already played from the same perspective, it's not quite the same because you're in a different location. If you enjoyed Samurai Warriors 4, you will enjoy Spirit of Sanada as well. It's just, again, there is a certain element of burnout here if you've played the whole 4 series. You know, weigh that up and judge for yourself whether you think it would be good to play. As a starting point for Warriors fans, it's not a bad one. For June, I'm kind of torn. See, there were 3 games from this month I played. One was Dead by Daylight, and fuck that game. And the other 2 are games that should have been home runs. They should have just been these incredible experiences, but certain elements of them just made them fall short. I'm of course talking about Tekken 7 and Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy. Tekken 7 still has the really good Tekken gameplay aside from the addition of those awful rage arts. And then you have the story, which, yes, I know some of you are going to say your story doesn't matter in a fighting game. To which I say, did you not see the fucking marketing? The marketing for this game was based around the story. This final clash between Heihachi and Kazuya that's been built up since the first game. The story is supposed to be a huge part of this experience, and it's fucking trash. There's a reason I'm planning a big massive critique of this game sometime this year. With Crash Bandicoot though, that's just recreating the first 3 games from the ground up. The problem there is that it's not a one-to-one recreation, and that in and of itself is not a bad thing, it's just the way it's different which is the problem, because the physics are kind of fucked up and janky, so it makes the games a lot harder. So even though Crash Bandicoot 3 is one of my 5 favourite games of all time, and this should basically just be that game but with better graphics, the added difficulty made me lose interest partway through, and I didn't finish any of the 3 games included. But there is one key factor that needs to be addressed here. Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy brought Crash Bandicoot back after the fucking dreadful Mind Over Mutant, which was in like 2008. The series is back, there is hope for new, good Crash games from people who at least have a general understanding of what made those games good, instead of people who are trying to reinvent the wheel. Tekken 7, conversely, does not give me hope for the future of the series. It's been going downhill since Tekken 6, and this game, oh my god. So flawed as it is, Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy is the best game of June 2017. I actually stopped recording here the first time because the original version of this was way more negative, which I'm trying to avoid when talking about the best games of the year. Yeah, this is me being positive. Welcome to my life. July is probably the hardest one so far, simply because I've not played any of the games that came out in July. But I did promise the best 12 games of the year, so Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age. It's a remaster of Final Fantasy XII with some basic improvements, and I've seen the cutscenes for the original, the story was decent. That's the only criteria I can judge July on, so that's all you're gonna get, sorry. Here we go. August. I played 3 games from this month: Sonic Mania, Uncharted Lost Legacy, and Agents of Mayhem. One of these games is an unfinished mess with a lot of wasted potential. Another one is mostly more of the same but with a girl now, and the other is a loving recreation of the classic games in its franchise, made by fans of the games who understand what made those games great to begin with, and is one of the most standout memorable games of the year. So obviously, yes, I'm giving this to Uncharted Lost Legacy. Agents of Mayhem had a lot of potential, it's not great, there's a lot of problems with it. Sonic Mania, it is a loving recreation of classic Sonic, and that's kind of the problem. It was a little too loving in a lot of areas, like how you still have limited lives, or there are now time limits, which I don't think the older games had, but we have them now, and if you run out of time, you fucking fail. They have shitty water levels, they have awful gimmicks in some of the stages, and I'm just not that big a fan of 2D Sonic games. I just think the series works a lot better in 3D because you can actually see where you're fucking going. Uncharted Lost Legacy doesn't really do a whole lot new. It has an open section like the one in Uncharted 4. It has a few slight changes to the gameplay from 4, but 4 was a really good game. Just because something doesn't change the formula too much doesn't make it bad. If you have a really good game and then a sequel that doesn't change a whole lot, it stands to reason that game will also be really good. And Uncharted Lost Legacy is really good. There are things I would have improved about it, yes, like I would have cut Nadine in favour of Charlie Cutter because Charlie Cutter is the best and Nadine is the worst, but it's still a fun game with some good Uncharted banter, as one would expect. It's not quite as meaningful as Uncharted 4, but then how could it be when 4 was so steeped in the franchise's characters and storyline, and this is mostly removed from that. It's basically 2 different kinds of stories with the same basic gameplay, while Mania is just the classic gameplay with not much improved, and classic Sonic had a lot of fucking problems. Mania probably would have been the one to make the list if they didn't have limited lives, time limits, and fucking water levels. The worst things in classic platformers. Warriors AllStars released in September in Europe, and that's the one game from that month I've played. It's one of those big celebration games, though it feels on the cheap side. A lot of the dialogue for the story isn't voiced for some reason, and most of the maps are just taken from previous games or just given a reskin to resemble a different franchise. There's good character interaction though, and the roster, while flawed, does have some really good characters and movesets. I'd like to see where they could go from here with Warriors AllStars if they were to do a sequel, and while it's disappointing when weighed up against Warriors Odyssey 3, it's still the best game I played from September this year. I've played 2 games from October, both on the Switch, Fire Emblem Warriors and Super Mario Odyssey. If I couldn't find a game from October, I would have given it to Cuphead just for exposing all these so-called game journalists as people who don't want to actually do their job but still want to get paid for it. Cuphead is therefore the most important game from October this year, but I didn't play it so I can't put it on the list. So we have what many consider to be the best Mario game in years, one of the best games overall in years, and just an instant classic. And then we have another Warriors game in the vein of Hyrule Warriors, just with Fire Emblem instead. If you liked Hyrule Warriors, you'll most likely like Fire Emblem. It's just that quite a few flaws carry over from Hyrule Warriors, like the badge system, and it has a few of its own, like bringing over the rock, paper, scissors system from Fire Emblem that doesn't really work in a Warriors game. And of course the campaign is very predictable, to the point I actually started to make a Warriors bingo card. But I don't know, I just liked it more than Mario. There's a lot to like about Mario Odyssey, don't get me wrong, but I think the hype was ridiculously overblown. Probably my biggest problems with the game are just how many collectibles there are that basically don't mean anything, and the controls. Yeah, the controls in this Mario game are bad. A lot of people are like, the game plays so well, but it doesn't. Only about half the buttons are actually used, and yet the buttons that are used have multiple actions associated with them. So you can do a dive in the air to give yourself more distance by pressing a certain 2 buttons, one of which is the stomp that sends you directly down. Why not assign the dive to its own dedicated button? The whole thing is just designed, oh, we want to have the Joy-Cons be usable individually, I guess, but just make 2 fucking control schemes. One for when you've got both Joy-Cons and have access to twice as many buttons, and one for when you've not. So yeah, it would be a bit more difficult in co-op, but that's not an excuse to damage the single player experience by making it harder to pull off Mario's moves, because trying to get yourself more distance more often than not sends you directly down. Fire Emblem Warriors is better than Mario Odyssey. Fuck you, fight me. For November, once again, just one game, that game being Sonic Forces. Now, I'm not putting Sonic Forces on here begrudgingly because it's the only game I can. Even if I was just making a normal top 10 games list, Sonic Forces would be on there. I really like Sonic Forces. I know some people are going to go fucking crazy about the fact that someone had the fucking audacity to like Sonic Forces more than Sonic Mania, but I just do. Sonic Forces gameplay is basically just the same as Generations, but with a few steps back and a few steps forward in a different direction. It's a step back because some of the levels feel a lot more automated and scripted compared to what Generations had, and also the fact that the drifting mechanic is completely gone. On the other hand, it doesn't have limited lives. It doesn't have limited lives. Even Nintendo, with their strict adherence to tradition, still removed limited lives from Mario Odyssey. Sonic Mania still has that. Why? Sonic Forces doesn't force me to replay an entire zone just because I lost all my lives in the second act. Now, the story of Sonic Forces is a fucking mess. It's quite clear that the intention was to be this big nostalgia trip like Generations, just focus on the bosses rather than the stages, but then they came up with the idea of the custom avatar, but by that point, they'd already announced that classic Sonic and these bosses were going to be returning, so they then combined the two ideas into a single story. That's what Sonic Forces ultimately is, and it's a real shame that it ended up that way, but still, the gameplay is really good. There are other flaws, of course, I could probably get into those, but I don't want to keep you here too long. Sonic Forces is a good game, okay? If you like Sonic Mania more than Forces, that's fine. I'm not criticising you for it, so don't fucking criticise my views, arseholes. And now here we are, December. There are technically 3 games I've played from this month. Yakuza Kiwami 2 came out in Japan and I've played the demo. I've played Okami HD, and I played Dead Rising 4 Frank's Big Package. None of these games are great. Kiwami 2's demo wasn't very long and it uses Yakuza 6's gameplay, which isn't that great. Okami HD, I've yet to be gripped by the game. And Dead Rising 4 is, well, Dead Rising 4. Dead Rising 4 has got a lot of problems. A lot. So looking at these 3 games, the one I've had the most fun with is Dead Rising 4. I know, fucking crucify me for having the gall to enjoy Dead Rising 4 because other people didn't, but it's fine. It's more of a generic open world than a proper Dead Rising game, but it still has some of the Dead Rising charm. There's a lot of wasted potential with the story, and yes, I will be discussing that in a future video. But the thing is, I was never bored like I am with Okami. The gameplay is fine. It does the job. I mean, it doesn't give me much hope for the fucking future of the franchise, but if the developers get another chance and learn from all the fucking stupid errors they made with this game, we could still get another really good Dead Rising out of it. I mean, I'm not really making a great case for this game, but I just liked it for what it was. So since I can't properly explain what it is about this game that I liked, let's just move on to the best game of the year. The top 3 games of the year are Yakuza 0, Resident Evil 7 and Persona 5. I think that's the kind of position that not many people outside of Nintendo tryhards are really going to argue with. Yes, I am deciding this on the fly as I record this off the cuff. God, the pressure's on now, innit? Oh god. It's Resident Evil 7. Persona 5 is a great game, don't get me wrong, it is a very, very good game. It's the kind of game where it's almost impossible to not like it. It's just, the game is a bit too long and there's some story developments that aren't great. There are points where the story just drags, or where the game just blazes through multiple days of the story so you can't actually do anything gameplay wise. And Morgana constantly telling you to go to bed even when I've got the upgrade that should let me go out at this time. Morgana's a piece of shit. There are just these problems that hold the game back, and then you go to Resident Evil 7, and while the game is quite short, you know, you can complete the game in about 2 to 3 hours, there is quite a lot of replay value, and especially if you've got all the DLC through purchasing them separately or through the complete edition, there's a lot of good content in this game, but it never feels dragged out. It feels like it's just the length it needs to be. Are there flaws? Of course there are flaws. Like the DLC Ethan Must Die is the worst fucking game mode I've ever played, but Resident Evil 7 is such a tight experience, so masterfully crafted that it's hard not to be impressed by how utterly shocking it was that this game turned out as good as it did. Again, I had a lot of doubt that this game would be all that great, but somehow it far exceeded my expectations, and that is why Resident Evil 7 is the best game of 2017. 2017 overall was just a really good year for gaming, aside from the whole Battlefront 2 debacle, so the only question left is, can 2018 live up to 2017? So what did you guys think of this video? Was it an interesting take on the top 10 games of the year type lists? I wouldn't mind doing this again next year, we'll see. And since this is the first video of 2018, let's kick things off right. If you like this video, why not subscribe and check out some of these other videos? If not, then be sure to share it with your enemies so they can suffer along with you.